speaker, Catherin Eubanks, who will open our panel on state-of-the-art research on the therapeutic relationship. Catherin Eubanks is a professor at the Shiba University. She is the president-elect of the SAPI, Society of Exploration in Psychotherapy Integration, recipient of Outstanding Early Career Award of SPR, recipient of Early Career Award of Division 29, and I can go on and on, but we won't wear
Thank you. Yeah, maybe hurry up. Just do it. Yeah. Yes. So I really appreciate this opportunity to speak. As some of you, many of you may be aware, Jeremy Safran was supposed to be here as part of this event, and if you don't already know, he died about 2 months ago, and so Oria and Sigal really graciously invited me to speak about my experience collaborating with him and the work we've been doing together. Jeremy was a huge figure in psychotherapy theory and research, and I had the privilege of working with him pretty closely for almost 12 years. So I'm going to speak a little bit about him and our work together, the patient and therapist dance. So I'm actually going to start with the first time I really met Jeremy. So I did my clinical internship at Beth Israel Medical Center in New York, where I met Chris Moran. I did a research rotation with him. He was one of my supervisors, and then he hired me to be his postdoctoral fellow. And so this is when I would really start working with Chris and Jeremy. At that point, Chris and Jeremy had been working together for a long time. And so I remember Chris had a meeting for the three of us in his office. And I already had the postdoctoral job, but it felt like this was like another job interview, right? Like, how would Jeremy feel about me and me entering this collaboration? So I'm going in there all ready to talk about my experience, or if he has questions about my research training or my dissertation or anything like that. So Chris and Jeremy start off with, oh, what are some projects Catherin could be involved in? And they're talking back and forth, and I'm just sitting there. And at some point, Jeremy just sort of stops the conversation, and he turns to me, and he smiles, and he says, "You have a very calming presence. I like that." And then turns back to the conversation. And externally, I stayed very calm, because apparently that was working for me, so I wasn't going to mess with that. But internally, I was like, what? Like, who is this guy? And he never asked questions about my research training or anything. But looking back, I can see that as a very Jeremy moment, right? He wasn't seeing me as a walking CV. He was seeing me as a person, and just spontaneously sharing his personal reaction in a genuine way that sort of facilitated the beginning of a relationship between us. I think one of the things that helped me be calm is I didn't realize at that time how big a deal Jeremy was. Like, I knew he was a big deal, but I didn't know how big a deal he was. And as I started working together with him and Chris, I got the chance to collaborate on some book chapters and really dive into their work and gain a better appreciation for the influential work Jeremy did with Les Greenberg early in his career on emotion and psychotherapy, and then the really influential work he did with Zindel Siegel on interpersonal schemas in cognitive therapy. And then when, I knew he and Chris Moran had done a lot on alliance ruptures, but I didn't realize they were like the alliance rupture people. So it was really exciting to become a part of that collaboration and to dive into their model. So let me talk a little bit about how they were understanding alliance ruptures. So they usually draw on Ed Borden's definition of the alliance as involving agreement on the goals of therapy, collaboration on tasks, and the existence of a bond between the patient and therapist, and sort of define a rupture as there being a problem in that, a deterioration in that process. So maybe disagreeing on goals, not being able to collaborate on the tasks, or strain in the emotional bond. we're using the word rupture, which might sound like a big dramatic break, but we really think of it as a broader concept, including more subtle strains in the relationship. And we like to think of ruptures as falling into two broad categories of confrontations and withdrawals. Confrontations being when the patient's moving against the therapist or therapy, like when the patient says, you're not helping me, would be a confrontation rupture. But also withdrawal ruptures where the patient's moving away from the therapist or the therapy, maybe changing the topic to get away from something. That both types can be important. And then how do you resolve these things? We like to think of sort of two categories of resolution strategies. So there are what we call immediate repair strategies, where the idea is you just sort of want to get back on track. So maybe the patient is objecting to a task because they don't really understand it, so you really explain the task and give a rationale for it. Or change the task, if that's helpful, or just clarify misunderstanding. You're not exploring or going deeper, you're just sort of getting back to what you were doing. And then there are also more expressive exploratory resolution strategies where you're using the rupture as an opportunity to really dive in and have a better understanding of what may be lying underneath that for the patient and what we could learn about relational schemas for the patient. And really using therapist metacommunication, or the therapist talking about what's happening right now between us to better understand it. Our research is focused on the second, these more expressive ones. That's what we think is like really interesting and fun to explore. But I do want to say that either one can be a good option depending on the clinical context. There are times when you need to continue with the task you're working on and you just kind of want to keep doing that for now. So it's not that you would explore all the time in every situation. But to expand on the exploratory one a little bit more, this is the stage process model that Jeremy and Chris developed through a series of task analyses. So the first stage is the therapist has to be aware their rupture is happening and draw attention to it. And by drawing their own and the patient's attention to it, they're able to get sort of unstuck. So this is disembedding. We can get out of whatever pattern we're stuck in. And then explore both the patient's experience and the therapist's experience of what's happening. And the hope is that this exploration will help us identify the wish or need of the patient that may underlie this rupture. And so our thinking is that, for example, under a confrontation rupture, where maybe there's hostility on the surface, there may be some vulnerability underneath that the patient is defending against. And you hope to create a space that's safe enough for the patient to explore that with you. And for a withdrawal rupture, where maybe the patient is trying to avoid or smooth things over, there may be some need underneath that they're not asserting, and you want to sort of help them be able to assert that and validate that. Now, doing this is hard, so in the process of trying to do it, the patients and the therapist may try to avoid, and so that's what stage 3 is. The idea is there may be avoidance maneuvers, and you sort of have to keep tracking the avoidance and then kind of coming back to the exploration. So you'd sort of be cycling through all of these at various stages. So we do have some research to support the idea that exploring or repairing ruptures could be good for outcome. Early in my collaboration with Chris and Jeremy, I had the chance to work with them on a meta-analysis of the small rupture literature that came out in 2011 as part of John Norcross's Psychotherapy Relationships That Work, second edition. And we just recently completed the meta-analysis for the 3rd edition of the book that's going to be coming out soon. And there'll also be an article version appearing in Psychotherapy. And in the meta-analysis, I should say, it's focused mostly on the quantitative studies. There's also a rich body of qualitative and task analytic research on rupture repair phenomena. But in the quantitative research, you have to be able to measure these things, which can be challenging. So the main ways that this has been done is direct self-report, where you basically give somebody a questionnaire and say, was there some tension, disagreement, misunderstanding during the session, and the patient and therapist just rate that. Then what we call indirect self-report, where you take alliance ratings and look and see were there these V-shaped dips, and sort of interpret that as maybe indicating a rupture and repair. And then finally, observer-based measures, like the measure we've developed, the 3RS, or Rupture Resolution Rating System, which I'll say more about a little bit later, and some other similar measures. Some of the challenges of measuring ruptures. as sort of a difficult dyadic phenomenon. It may be that there are ruptures that happen that the therapist misses or that the patient doesn't recognize, so you can't just rely on self-report. And then even if people recognize something is going amiss in the relationship, they may be reluctant to say so. It may be hard for somebody to say we have a problem in our relationship. A patient may be afraid they're getting their therapist in trouble, or the therapist may feel ashamed about acknowledging it or something. So then we can use observers, and that's really helpful, but observers aren't in the dyad, and observers can't read people's minds. So they can never completely know how hurt or misunderstood or distant or close two people feel. So we really need all of these pieces working together to try to get a sense of what's going on. And then another complicated thing is ruptures can extend across time. So if we're just picking this one session, we may see a lot of ruptures, but we don't know if they were later resolved. Or we may not know that what we're seeing is actually the resolution of something that came before. So ideally, we'd be using multiple measures in every single session, which is labor intensive, so this can be a research challenge. Then another challenge is the relationship between ruptures and outcome is probably complicated. Ruptures can contribute to poor outcome and to dropout if they're not resolved, but then if you explore them, if you really take advantage of them as an opportunity, they can be this transformational thing that actually contributes to good outcome. So trying to look at the relationship between ruptures and outcome is complex, and you have to really be tracking, were the ruptures eventually repaired or not to understand what's going on. So just to briefly summarize the results of the meta-analysis, it's still a small but growing literature. So in this one we had 11 studies, about 1,300 patients. Rupture repair measured all the different ways that I mentioned, with outcome measured as symptom improvement and or whether the patient completed or dropped out of therapy. And we got a moderate effect size, suggesting there's a medium relationship between rupture repair and good treatment outcome. As you might expect, with a lot of different methods being used in different populations and samples, there was a lot of heterogeneity across the effect sizes. So we looked for moderators that might explain better what's going on here. And the only one that came out as almost significant was the timing of the rupture measurement. So if you measured rupture repair early in treatment and tried to link that to outcome, that was a weaker relationship. If you measured rupture repair across the full treatment to link that to outcome, there was a stronger relationship. On the one hand, well, obviously, right, if we measure something across therapy, it's going to be better at predicting what happened. But I think that also points to the importance with ruptures. If you only measure them early, you miss if they were later resolved. We did a second meta-analysis looking at rupture resolution training and outcome. So can we train therapists to do this, and then does that lead to better patient outcome? This was a smaller group of just 6 studies, 276 trainees. And the effect size was small and did not reach significance. When we did this in 2011, we had a fairly similar effect size of 0.15. That one did reach significance. We once again did moderator analyses and had more moderators here this time. If there were more patients with personality disorder diagnoses, the relationship between this rupture resolution training and outcome was weaker. If the treatment was a more CBT treatment, we sort of rated, was it more like CBT or more like psychodynamic, then the training seemed to be more associated with patient outcome. Also for briefer treatments, there seemed to be a stronger connection between the training and outcome. But then when we put those two in the same meta-regression, since the CBT treatments tended to be briefer, they were sort of explaining the same variance. But in all, we found limited evidence for rupture resolution training improving patient outcome. But some suggestion that maybe this kind of training could be particularly valuable, maybe in CBT. We were speculating that perhaps for CBT, drawing so much attention to the patient-therapist relationship was more adding something new the CBT trainees weren't getting. Maybe not adding as much new for psychodynamic trainees, maybe. And I did want to talk about a study we did recently that we couldn't include in the meta-analysis because it was just too different methodologically, supporting the idea of alliance-focused training for CBT therapists. So these and this study's been published recently in JCCP if you're interested in seeing the full study. So these next few slides are courtesy of Chris Moran. So in this study, what we did is first we had trainees. We taught them CBT. They did an extended CBT didactic for several months. Then they got assigned a case, and they saw the case in CBT, and they had to show that they were adherent to CBT in this case. So one patient for 30 sessions. Then we moved to a second phase where they would get a second patient. Now this time the therapists were randomly assigned to either cohort 1 or cohort 2, and they would start in CBT, and then they would switch from CBT supervision to alliance-focused training. So same patient, same therapist. The only thing that's changing is what supervision group you're going to. These are all group supervisions. And one group was doing this after session 8, and one group was doing this after session 16. So what we were hoping to see is changes in therapist and patient behavior that would match up with when they switched, so that we could say, looks like it's maybe due to the training. And what we did find that. We used the SASB, the Structural Analysis of Social Behavior by Lawrence Smith Benjamin, to code patient and therapist behaviors in sessions before and after the switch, and found that after switching to alliance-focused training, therapists were showing less criticism and less directiveness and more affirmation and expressiveness. And patients were showing less appeasement and dependence and more expressiveness. And I should add that this was a sample of cluster C personality disorder patients, and personality disorder not otherwise specified. So for these patients to be less appeasing and less dependent was a move in the right direction. So we were happy with that. And just so you can see what that looks like, so you can see here the people who switched to alliance-focused training at 8 had the shift earlier than the people who switched at session 16. And here we have both the patient and therapist becoming more expressive, which is what we were hoping for if they're talking about being able to talk about ruptures more in treatment. We should see more expression from both the patient and the therapist. So what were we doing in this alliance-focused training? So like I said, it's group supervision with the goal of fostering therapist self-awareness. Like you have to be aware of what's going on so you can be aware of when a rupture is happening. Emotion regulation, so that a rupture can be difficult for a therapist. It's going to bring up feelings, and you need to be able to deal with those in a useful, helpful way and not lash out defensively at a patient or like run away from what's going on. So being able to tolerate that. And then interpersonal sensitivity, so that you can talk about what's happening in a sensitive way. It can be challenging sometimes to talk about a rupture in a way that doesn't sound critical or blaming of the patient, right? Like, you're making this really hard for me. You have to kind of navigate that carefully, so we were trying to foster that. And the way we were trying to do this was through encouraging videotape analysis of rupture moments. So don't bring the video of what you thought was the best moment in your session. Bring the worst moment. Bring the moment you were stuck, frustrated, confused, lost. And then it's on the supervisors to make sure people feel safe doing that and showing those moments to their peers in a group context. Then doing awareness-oriented role plays where you might be playing your patient and another member of the group is playing the therapist. Then you might switch, or you might even go back and forth from one chair to another, playing both sides. And this does give you the chance to practice, like to practice having certain words come out of your mouth. But really, the main goal is for you to become more aware of what's happening for you as a therapist. To realize maybe you were more frustrated with your patient than you wanted to admit, or maybe you were more scared about something. And it can be really helpful to do this in a group, because also we're trying to engage everybody's reactions to what's happening. So maybe you have feelings that you're not totally in touch with, but then you hear your peers say them and you're like, oh, you're right, that's what's happening for me. It can also be very validating when everybody's like, yeah, that's really tough. They're sort of all sharing that experience. And then finally, mindfulness training. So we start every supervision meeting with a mindfulness exercise, encourage people to practice mindfulness outside of training to really encourage that awareness, and awareness in an accepting, non-judgmental way of what's going on for you and what's going on for the other person. I had the opportunity to co-lead a supervision group with Jeremy for about 8 years. And it was really neat that, if something grabbed his attention, he would just light up and just go after it with a lot of energy. And it was really neat to see those moments when he would do that and really help a therapist get in touch with what was happening for them in a session. And not in a way that veered into it being therapy for the therapist. Like, it stayed within the supervision frame, but you got the sense that it was something that was not only helpful clinically, but like helpful personally for the therapist to be able to explore these feelings and think about, not talk about in the group, but maybe reflect on themselves where it was coming from. So I wanted to, at the end here, talk about a case that I saw that Jeremy supervised. I guess last year or so, I wanted to see a case in the research program. I had not seen a case myself in the research program since I was a postdoc, but I thought, you know, if I want to get better at this, I need to have the experience of being supervised, I need to be videotaped, I need to be able to watch my own tapes, I'm going to do this. And Jeremy very graciously offered to supervise me. And the first part of this case, I actually wrote up for a chapter in a book that's coming out, I think next year, edited by Uli Kramer, on case formulation for personality disorders. So what I did with this, in this book chapter, is I used the 3RS, the observer-based measure of ruptures and resolution, to code my own case and to sort of develop a process-based case formulation. So let me just say a little bit about the 3RS. This was one of the, when I first started working with Chris and Jeremy, one of the early projects, they were like, we need an observer-based measure of ruptures and repairs, go do this. And it was based in large part on Heather Harper's dissertation. She's from the UK, and she had done this dissertation where she had these great markers of confrontation and withdrawal. So we took that and then added to it and added on resolution strategies. We were trying to do something that was going to be user-friendly for research purposes, so not require transcription, not require you to be a clinical, super experienced therapist to be able to use it. And we're excited to see that a number of research groups are now using it and getting some really interesting results, which is great. So the basic markers in this coding system, you're watching the session and looking for moments when there are examples of confrontation and withdrawal. So things like the patient's complaining about you or the work or the progress, or maybe they're moving away, they're changing the topic, they're telling avoidance stories, they're giving you a one-word response to an open-ended question. And then we also look for resolution strategies, the therapist's attempt to resolve, including some of those more immediate ones, like just illustrating a task, and some of the more exploratory ones, like inviting the patient's thoughts and feelings about what's happening, or disclosing the therapist's internal experience of what's happening. When we use this for research, we code confrontation and withdrawal as patient behaviors. But we recognize that both patients and therapists are contributing to whatever's going on, right? It's the patient and therapist dance. They're both in the dance. And maybe in future versions of the 3RS we'll be able to capture that better. But what I did for this book chapter is I went ahead and coded both myself and the patient. So trying to apply this on both ends. So this case, I'm going to call him Matt, a young guy in his 30s, and he was coming to receive 30 weeks of brief relational therapy, which is our sort of alliance-focused approach. He'd been diagnosed with dysthymia and generalized anxiety disorder, and also with narcissistic personality disorder on axis 2. So I was expecting there would be confrontation ruptures, and I was also feeling a lot of pressure myself, because I was aware that everything was going to be videotaped and might be presented somewhere, and I'm now supposed to know something about this, and could I actually deliver? So early in our first session, you could right away see examples of this patient's kind of rupture style, and then also how I was responding to it. So very early in our first session, he said, "Is the hope to work towards something that would be concluded by those 30 sessions?" So I was sort of hearing this as putting some pressure on me, but also not directly, not "can you help me?" but kind of saying it in this sort of intellectualized, abstract way. And so you can see from my response that I was feeling the pressure. That's a good question. That's one way to go. Another way to go is think of it as there are things you could start working on in 30 sessions, and you might decide you then want to get more treatment. And in the end, we could talk about options for continuing, like a referral. So I'm like a little deferential appeasing, trying to give a rationale. I'm also like, neither of us are really addressing the can I help you? Like, you know, now I'm like getting way ahead of myself, like referral, like, you know, the pressure I'm feeling is coming out. So if we think about Saffron and Moran's model in terms of confrontation and withdrawal, like I suggested earlier, underlying the confrontation we're thinking is some kind of vulnerability, and underlying the withdrawal are some kind of needs that the patient's not clearly expressing. So I need to get at those, and I need to be able to tolerate the aggression of the confrontation and try to get to a place where we can acknowledge the underlying vulnerability, and then also let's see what those needs are and encourage my patient to assert them and validate them. So I started to get a little bit better sense of this as we moved along, but right here it's already clear he's going to be critical with his confrontations, and he's going to be intellectualized with a lot of his withdrawals. Okay, so move ahead to session 7, which is our rupture session, because it had a low alliance rating, and on that post-session questionnaire, where we basically asked if there was a rupture, he said yes, and how much was it happening in the session, he put constantly. So he started out the session, he was having a medical issue, and he started out with lots of complaints about medical providers who were not being helpful. So I'm hearing this as complaining about progress with me, right? And so he says, I'm just trapped with my like crippling health and existential problems and just like stuck in the cold, doing stupid things, trying to like reclaim my life like bit by bit, and it's pretty exhausting and not like ever gratifying. So what there is here is you can hear some of the hopelessness, sort of like treatment can't help me because it's just a lost cause. And when I watch the tape now, I can really see that. I can see his sadness. But at the time, I was still kind of stuck in the complaints about progress from before. So my response is not so attuned. Wow, you sound angry today. And he says, I guess. So here he doesn't directly tell me I'm wrong. He's being somewhat deferential. So at least I pick up that I'm off the mark. So I say, is that the right word? He says, more like in despair. So he's telling me now how he's feeling. So now I have a sense, a little bit better sense of what's going on. But despair is really hard to sit with, right? And for me, despair brings up my desire to go in and fix it. So I encourage him various things he could do to be, I thought he was being hard on himself, encourage him to be more compassionate toward himself, which I'm really withdrawing from the despair. So he totally dismisses all my suggestions in a very critical way. And then he starts complaining about his ex-girlfriend and how unhelpful she was. And so he's talking about her. It's not helpful to say, like, shut up, like, I don't want to hear about this anymore. Like, go do something. It's just useless. Did it feel like that's what I was saying? I said. I didn't feel like it was something you considered to be an act of generous support. I thought it was just basically a small inquiry of like, oh, it sounds like you're not capable of just like letting this stuff pass over you, so let's talk about why that is. It didn't feel to me like that was an actual, like an offer I can take seriously. So now it's really on the table, his complaints about me. So now I have a better sense, okay, underneath that criticism, there's despair. And the needs, he doesn't need for me in that moment to be urging him to be nice to himself. He really needed me to be with him in his despair, and I was missing that. So move ahead to session 13. So I'm talking about our relationship. I don't know, a sense of like, don't get too close, I'm not gonna let you in too much. Talking about how I feel like he's not letting me in. I'm disclosing my experience of what's happening. I feel like I'm totally open to that. Even with relative strangers, I'm open to that. So he's kind of defensive. In here, I mean, let's be specific. Yeah, I mean, I don't like it when you ask me certain things that don't really make sense to me. I'll always try to like hear them or respond to them as well as I can. So he's still defending himself. So I say, yeah, I believe that, and I don't want this to sound, I'm not trying to be critical either, and I hope it doesn't sound like that. So I'm acknowledging that I'm doing something that's eliciting his defensiveness, right? I'm contributing to this dynamic. No, but I don't think it's a barrier that's like a wall that I'm like creating to avoid. It's mainly I don't even understand what the things are. A few weeks ago, you asked me something like, do you not let people love you? I still don't know what the hell that means. But it's not like, no, we don't discuss that, like, that's too close. So here he starts out by kind of smoothing things over, like, no, you're not offending me. But then, slips like, the things you say make no sense. But then, smiles at the end. So he kind of keeps moving away to sort of soften things and so that he's not going to completely reject me. Yeah, and you don't feel something, you don't have, like saying that right now, talking about that idea of not letting people love you, that doesn't bring up, I'm trying to get somewhere in there. And he says, it feels kind of like what robots get in Star Trek. Like something more like it just doesn't actually compute. It's like a little concerning. I can't really see it. It's a little concerning to go, is there something some basic thing I just don't actually understand? That's more the feeling. Like, did I just not learn like a basic human concept? So for me, this really brought home that even when he was being really difficult, he was at the same time really trying. He was like really trying to answer my questions and really trying to maintain a connection with me. So now I had a better sense of what was going on with him. And I'll come back to him again in just a second. So wanted to conclude some of the lessons that I've learned from doing this work with Jeremy over the years. And one is definitely therapy and research is art. Psychotherapy and psychotherapy research, I think, at their best, and this goes along with things Louis was saying, things Jonathan was saying, bring art and science together. And the art, we don't want to lose the art piece of it when we get really scientific and really into all our big data sets and our statistical models. And Jeremy was an artist. And this is even how he sort of thought of it. I mean, he and I had some interesting conversations about that. He was really interested in an idea that was interesting and elegant and beautiful, and a theory that was beautiful. And I think that was part of what helped him be creative and come up with things that have such resonance for so many people, was his appreciation of that beauty. Now don't get me wrong, we had plenty of research meetings where ideas are being talked about, not like, I'm raising my hand, I'm like, that sounds really nice, but what's the correlation of outcome? So it's important to keep that in mind too. But it's really important not to lose that artistic sensibility that he really embodied. And his therapeutic stance of being intensely curious and always genuine, willing to be vulnerable, and very courageous. His whole line of research is about diving into the most difficult moments that happen in therapy, not shying away from them, but really exploring them as opportunities. And this really grew out of just who he was as a person and how he was as a person. So there's this idea of what we research is me-search, that what we research resonates with us in some way. And I think very much his research interest grew out of who he was as a person, his interest in connecting with other people and collaborating with other people. And for me, I was sort of reflecting on why I'm so interested in this work and why his ideas have been so meaningful for me. I'm an overly conscientious perfectionist who feels guilty about something every minute of the day. So these core truths that I think come through in his work, that we all make mistakes. Let's be curious about them. And there are opportunities to learn and grow, is incredibly liberating and powerful for somebody like me. So I'm going to end with an anecdote about that patient I was presenting. So in our supervision, Jeremy was always urging me, like, he won't let you in, you've got to find a way in. He would encourage me to self-disclose more than I might want to, or to really dive into difficult topics. We had one session where the patient and I were really wrestling over something. He was like, that's great, you're both in there, that's really good. So I was seeing this patient, I wrote about the first half of this patient then took a job somewhere else, moved away for a while. he said he would come back to finish the treatment. And it took him a while to come back, and actually during the wait, we'd have these research meetings where we'd be like, how many cases do we have going? And I'd be like, we have my case, and everyone would smile and be like, yeah, Catherin, your case. Like, no one believed he was coming back. But then he came back, and Jeremy was delighted, and we resumed our supervision, and got through to the end of the 30 sessions. So we just finished 2 weeks ago, this patient and I. So I was seeing this patient over the time when Jeremy died. So, and obviously the patient didn't know that. So Jeremy never got to hear how the case ended. So in our last session with this patient, we were reflecting on our work together and how the treatment had gone. And he was still, talking about the ways in which the treatment had disappointed him and not met all of his expectations, but also acknowledging ways in which it was helpful. And thinking about this was the patient who wouldn't let me in, right? So we're getting up to leave. I'm walking to the door. And since it's our last session, I don't shake hands at the end of every session, but the last session, I felt like we should, shake hands. So I reach my hand out, and the patient turns to me and he says, "Can I have a hug?" And I was really touched by that. And so I hugged him, and then he turned to walk away. And I thought, Jeremy would have loved that. Thank you.